So police are investigating claims that some of the employees that were working on the construction sites may have been unskilled and others undocumented. Let's talk to labour expert and consultant Tony Healy to talk about undocumented workers and some of the challenges they would be facing in situations like this. Tony, good morning to you. Thank you so much for being available to us. I want to start with that disclaimer that we haven't established all of the facts in this matter, but there is this expectation, unconfirmed reports that some of the employees may have been unskilled and undocumented. And we know that there have been conversations with various consulates, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and other places. In a context like this, just talk to us about the requirements, first of all, for anyone who's reporting to a construction site such as this. What should happen in the ideal scenario?
Well, good morning. The first thing that should happen is that the employer has a duty, a legal duty, to make an in good faith attempt to ensure that any person that they employ is not an undocumented foreign nationals. In other words, they can be lawfully employed. So every employer to begin with must ensure that they can show that they've gone to, made an effort to find out, for example, is this ID book legitimate? Is this work permit legitimate? Is it valid? Is it potentially fraudulent? And very few employers make any effort at all when it comes to that. And then, of course, if you're a job applicant, you cannot take on employment without, of course, being properly documented and having a work permit and or an ID document, or have a valid, lawful reason to be in the country.
In your experience, Tony, how rife is this practice of using undocumented workers? We'll talk about the rights and responsibilities attached with this type of employment in just a moment, but just give us a sense of the context.
Look, it's widespread. There's absolutely no doubt that there is widespread and has been for some time. We can call it abuse of the legislation, and there's lots of legislation around the subject. And many of us will have heard in our social circles and even in our working circles of situations where employers do employ foreign nationals who are undocumented for various reasons, they'll say, and then they fall foul of all kinds of bits of law. So there's no doubt that this has been an ongoing issue. Government's been responding to it in various ways with various pieces of legislation, if you like, clamping down on this practice. But of course, this tragedy in George has brought this back into front and center for government.
If it's indeed found that these were undocumented, potentially unskilled, and possibly even abused workers on the site, what liabilities, both civil and criminal, does everyone involved with the project face, Tony?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Look, the employers have broken all kinds of pieces of law. They've broken the Immigration Act, Section 38. They're supposed to ensure that they only employ properly documented, if you like, job applicants. They can pay a fine and or be imprisoned. I mean, we've had clients where there've been raids on their factories and they've been thrown in the police van and arrested and locked up. We get calls daily from employers saying, because it's become such an issue, we're faced with a situation, we just found out that X is undocumented, what do we do? But to your point, those employers, once identified, if they ever are absolutely liable to all kinds of criminal and civil action. They're breaking a whole host of, the list is too long to mention, pieces of legislation which are really have very serious consequences. And many employers don't even understand that.
Tony, part of the complicated or the complex nature of employment under these circumstances are, again, both anecdotal and other evidence around people waiting a long time for documents, being in a desperate situation, needing to find work, needing to be able to support themselves or their families. So it's not always this sort of perfect environment where they may be able to access work permits, get residency and basically become documented in South Africa. And while, from a principle perspective, I suppose some would say that's unjustifiable, but from a moral perspective, you can perhaps empathize with the dilemma they might find themselves in these contexts, being abused or being exploited. What risks, do they face? Because there certainly wouldn't be things like provision for workmen's compensation and other insurances for such workers, or would there be?
Well, there would be if they, because we must remember that it's a great question. We must remember that regardless of the fact that they're undocumented, they absolutely have all the protections of any worker who is documented. So our Constitution covers for fair labour practices for all employees. It does not qualify it by saying, but only documented employees. And there's lots of case law that talks to the fact that regardless of you being documented or not, you're still covered. So if you employ me, I'm undocumented, you dismiss me, and Department of Labour finds out that I've not been registered for UIF, the Department of Labour will then go to my employer and say, hang on a second, what's going on here? You still should have registered him for COIDA, you still should have registered him for UIF. So, undocumented employees have exactly the same rights from an employment law perspective as a documented employee.
This is so interesting because I think this is one area that's sort of remained grey about whether there is any liability specifically in relation to the harm or, the injuries, and in this case, the deaths that workers have experienced on a site like this. So that's hugely useful, Tony, in understanding. So can the families make those claims? I mean, whose responsibility is it then to begin to initiate that process of saying, my loved one, documented or not, was killed or died under these circumstances working on this construction site? What happens next?
Any undocumented employee's family where the undocumented employee dies in service, regardless of the fact that they're undocumented, the family has a right to go to the employer and start claiming the compensation and the payments that are due to them through, for example, the compensation fund and the unemployment insurance fund, as if they were documented. So they still have recourse. And that employer would then, for example, if they haven't been registered for UIF, then they need to pay back premiums and they'll need to pay a penalty to ensure that that deceased employee, if that were the case, is covered, so that the family may then claim for the passing of their family member.
It's such a sad situation, Tony, and just to think that there are still dozens of people under that rubble, as each day goes by, the possibility of anyone being found alive becomes less and less, although we heard from part of the team involved in the rescue that you can never quite give up on the possibility of still finding people alive. But it is a grim and grave situation. I don't know if you can recount other incidents in South Africa, similar tragedies, perhaps not on this scale, and how they were ultimately resolved, to get a sense of where this could end.
I can't offhand, Iman, think of anything any incident similar to this. That I'm sure there has been, but I think what's important is if one were to be faced with this kind of situation as a family, a surviving family member, there certainly is great recourse to the employer. And as I mentioned earlier, what many don't understand is that undocumented employees have exactly the same employment law rights that a documented employee would have.
A hint as to the level of a lack of care in the situation, are there for us to look at? The fact, and I was talking to our reporter not too long ago about whether any of the employers, the construction company, the contractor, the developer, or anyone has been in contact with the families, even while the investigation and I suppose blame mongering continues, at least there's a level of empathy with the families to say that even though that's happening and the investigations are there, we will commit to those, but we really feel for this tragedy has happened, feel for you that this tragedy has happened. There's another clue in the death or the number of those involved. Initially, we're running a story with 75 people trapped or involved in the incident, and that number days later being revised to 81. It gives you a sense that those who were working there there was no attention really paid, at least from the outside, maybe perhaps there was and the investigation will reveal that, to make sure that the names, the identities, the register for that day had been properly put together and collated. Is that a fair assessment to make that these are all signs of a company that should have behaved better?
Well, look, I don't want to comment specifically on the company, but I can tell you this, that every employer has a duty to ensure that they have records of employees, they have records of attendance in and out of work each day, they can account for employees, and that they are complying fully with their legal obligations as far as, for example, health and safety is concerned. For any employer, if there's an incident of this nature and they cannot confirm who was on duty, they cannot confirm that they've been registered for UIF, they cannot confirm that they're registered with the compensation fund, etc., etc., etc. They cannot confirm that they are properly documented. Any employer in that situation is really in for the legal high jump, because all of those, and can go to jail. There's all kinds of implications for any employer who would behave in a circumstance as I've just hypothetically described.
And finally, Tony, how big a moment is this for South Africa? In the commission of such a tragedy, what will be left behind in terms of best practice going forward, in terms of ensuring that level of care is there for workers?
Yeah, I think two things are definitely going to happen. There's no doubt that this is going to accelerate a process that's already started when it comes to the question of confronting the employment of undocumented foreigners. And I've also no doubt it's going to have a major impact on health and safety provisions and potentially legislation. And I think it's also going to have, thirdly, an impact on the registration of contractors, and particularly in the construction industry.
Tony Healy, Labour expert and consultant, thank you very much for your time and for your analysis this morning. We really appreciate it.